A few days ago, a video called Hillary Wants War was produced by a YouTuber that I quite like, someone called Sargon of Akkad. In it, he talks about a multitude of different conflicts going on in the Middle East and North Africa. And in this video, I'm going to talk about what he got wrong in that video and why I think it matters that in the future he makes sure that he gets these things right. The video begins with Sargon talking about Libya and the NATO intervention which took place there. But if I may, I'm going to start my criticism of his video slightly later and then come back to Libya at the end. The part of the video that I'm going to start with is where he lays out what he perceives to be NATO's current policy within the Middle East. And I'm going to talk about what I think is wrong with it.
And this brings us to the cycle of Western intervention in the Middle East. Secular Middle Eastern dictators suppressed Islamists and various other assorted jihadis because they are a threat to the dictator's power. The West invades to support a native, usually Islamist uprising to oust the dictator, for our own reasons, I'm sure. The lack of unity in the Islamist forces prevents a stable government from forming. The power vacuum caused by the loss of the dictator causes a persistent civil war between the rebels. The chaos and Islamist links facilitate the Islamic State entering the country and gaining territory. This opens a new front on the global jihad currently being waged by these radical Islamists, and the West has to spend time and money in a futile attempt to contain the Islamic State in perpetuity, even though it was the West's own actions that help facilitate the spread of the Islamic State. This is what has happened in Libya, and broadly speaking, it's what happened in Iraq, and it's what will happen in Syria if Hillary is successful and manages to overthrow Bashar al-Assad.
Now, as I said earlier, I will return to Libya at the end of the video. The reason for this is because I don't actually know as much about that particular conflict as I do about Iraq and Syria. And that's why when I'm talking about this list, I'm going to focus on these conflicts in particular.
Secular Middle Eastern dictators suppressed Islamists and various other assorted jihadis because they are a threat to the dictator's power.
So, in response to this, I'll focus on the actions of Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad. So, where to start? I suppose I'll begin with Saddam Hussein, just why not? Until approximately 1991, this could have been said about Saddam Hussein. However, after the failure on his part to invade Kuwait, the Iraqi Ba'ath Party went under a complete mutation away from secularism, if you will, secular fascism, towards Salafism, almost completely. The reason for this was because after Saddam Hussein was removed from Kuwait in 1991, there was a very large uprising, a predominantly Shia uprising, in the south of the country, which Saddam Hussein very brutally put down, killing anywhere upwards to 50,000 people in doing so. But not only did he slaughter large swathes of the populace of the south, he became after this increasingly paranoid about the Shias within his country. The reason for this is because Saddam Hussein came from a minority within the country, the Sunni Arabs. And so in order to maintain his monopoly over the resources of the country, he empowered the Sunni Arab minority. This began by, first of all, purging a great many of the Shia upper echelon of the Ba'ath Party, and continued over the next 10 years in something called the Faith Campaign, in which Saddam Hussein attempted to merge Ba'athism, Iraqi Ba'athism, with Salafism, as I say. Allahu Akbar was put onto the Iraqi flag. Mosques were built, ginormous mosques. In fact, the biggest one in the world, the so-called Saddam Hussein Mosque, was built at a time when people were dying in Iraq for lack of food and water and medicine after sanctions were put on the country after its removal from Kuwait. Saddam Hussein even went so far as to have a Quran written in his own blood. The propagation of Salafism within the country and the repression of the Shia not only would lead to the radicalization of the Sunni Arab population, which, it's worth mentioning, did not happen in the predominantly Sunni Kurdish region, but would lay the groundworks for the sectarian war which would erupt within Iraq between the Shias and the Sunnis. Not only this, but a great number of the people leading the vanguard of the Sunni insurgency would be former members of the Ba'ath Party who were converted to Salafism during Saddam Hussein's faith campaign.
Delegitimizing them as Islamists, delegitimizing them as not religious, that is the death pill of ISIS. That will kill ISIS.
They go for that, and it's easier for Al Qaeda's people and for the other jihadi Salafist sympathizers, because if ISIS isn't the end point of their ideology or isn't connected to their ideology, then they don't have to do any self-criticism. It's all it's the Baathists who they were always against.
Exactly.
So it's fine. But so Haji Bakr's one, but other people like Adnan as-Suwaidawi, who was the military council leader, not after him actually directly, because that was Adnan al-Bilawi, and then Suwaidawi followed him, and both of them had joined ISIS in 2003 and 4, and they were actually friends and were close to Zarqawi. But a lot of the military people, the people who've led the military campaign, joined early on, and we have every reason to think that they were genuine believers if they joined at that time.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna think. What I wanted to mention was I think this narrative of these are completely. Let's play that out through, right? So these people of the highest echelons of ISIS right now, like it's like 8 of them now. It used to be like 3, but they became there were a lot more of them at one point, but now there's like a reduction because of the amount of people we've killed. 3 out of 21 or 8 out of 21 of them were Baathists at one point. Is it more likely that these people have been playing pretend for 14 years, right? Or is it more likely that they were swayed, they were persuaded, and became believers? To what extent is really irrelevant.
Yeah.
Even if you're a shitty believer, you can believe in the cause and do other things that other people can't do simply because they're believers. So it's a really interesting layer that I think people overlook.
Well, I was going to say, I'd say 2 things. One is a lot like with Saddam's. For the people who don't think Saddam had some kind of conversion experience, as I tend to do, but who think he remained a cynical user of religion for power until the end, it actually doesn't matter in the sense.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
If the regime's enforcing Sharia, it's beheading prostitutes on the doorsteps of their father. It's cold comfort to them to know that Saddam doesn't think that's the real punishment that should be given out. And
the West invades to support a native, usually Islamist uprising to oust the dictator, for our own reasons, I'm sure.
Now, moving on to Mr. Assad. I could right now talk about his involvement with Hezbollah, but I'll save that particular argument for later on in the video. As for right now, I'll focus predominantly on Sunni jihadism as opposed to Shia. I'll start off by talking about Mr. Assad's actions prior to the uprising in Syria and what he did to ensure that al-Qaeda in Iraq, later to become the Islamic State in Iraq in Syria, or ISIS, would be a very effective force in its insemination. During the time Iraq was put under sanctions, the UN began something known as the Oil for Food program, which was a program instituted to ensure that the main victims of the sanctions within the country would be the Ba'athist elites, would be the regime itself, and not the population of Iraq. This did not work. The Oil for Food campaign was a complete and utter failure that was fraught with corruption and infiltrated on many levels. Smuggling routes were created to ensure that commodities outside of just necessities were moved both in and out of the country. And the main profiteers of this particular debacle will one day go on to be in charge of a very effective force fighting on the side of Bashar al-Assad called the Desert Hawks. But perhaps a conversation for another time about them. What's important is that these smuggling routes would be later used by Abu Musad al-Zarqawi, the leader of the Islamic State insurgency in Iraq, in order to smuggle fighters and weapons into Iraq. But where exactly did those fighters come from? As early as 2005, Bashar al-Assad began smuggling Sunni jihadists from Syria into Iraq to attack US forces within that country. Now, the reason for him doing this, you could argue, might be that he wants to get these people out of his own country. But that's not exactly the thesis that I have. I would instead look to your video to figure out why he did this.
This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
Now, whether or not such a memo existed, it still remains the fact that it's within Assad's interest to attack the state-building attempts made within Iraq by America, because he knows that his own regime doesn't have a lot of time. What he's trying to do here is twofold. First of all, he's trying to ward off the Americans, give them such a hard time that they won't try and invade his country, won't topple his regime. And secondly, he's trying to show his own people, look what happens when you remove the dictator. Look what happens when you get rid of me. It will be nothing but jihadists, nothing but war, nothing but nihilism. You have to keep me. You might not like me, but it can get a hell of a lot worse. Now, it would appear that many people have fallen for this ploy. And if I may now, I'll fast forward to the beginning of the Syrian uprising. Now, when the protests in Syria began, this was no jihadist enterprise. It was a peaceful movement, much like the one in Egypt, calling for the removal of the regime and for that to be replaced with a democratic system. How does Mr. Assad respond to this? Well, before his goons start firing into the crowds of protesters, he decides to release 300 hardened Salafist jihadists from prisons across Syria. These men, coincidentally, would go on to be at the heads of organizations such as Jabhat Fatah al-Sham and the Islamic State. Not only this, but throughout the war, as it disintegrated into further and further violence, it was evident that Mr. Assad's primary target was not jihadists. He allowed them to fester, he permitted them to grow, while he targeted the democratic opposition. Why? Because his entire objective within this war was to not give the West a viable alternative to him. Give the West the choice of Assad, Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, or the Islamic State, and who do you think they are going to choose? Not only did he permit them to grow, but often facilitated it, making transactions over oil, which he never made with any of the democratic opposition within the country. The greatest comparison I could make between Assad and someone else would be to compare him to a man called Cesare Borgia, son of Rodrigo the Pope, who in the Renaissance inherits or conquers, I forget which, a large piece of land. The people who live within this land are not particularly happy about him ruling over them. So what does he do? He hires a commander, and he sends this commander into the area. This commander beheads people, castrates people, disembowels them, destroys all the organized opposition to Cesare, but incredibly infuriates the local populace. They hate the commander, they despise him. And now there's great upheaval. So what does Cesare do? He takes the commander and he cuts him in half and dumps his body in the town square, and all of a sudden he's the hero. The organized opposition is dead. The person that slaughtered the opposition is dead, and all that is left is Cesare, looking like the hero to the world. Well, this is the case with Syria as well, except we are the people. The jihadists are the commander, and Bashar al-Assad, as you may guess, is Cesare Borgia.
The lack of unity in the Islamist forces prevents a stable government from forming.
My main problem with what you're saying here is that you're implying that somehow there is unity within the regime forces inside of Syria. You seem to be implying that it's only the rebels that have infighting, it's only the rebels that fight amongst each other, and that the regime may not be pleasant, but if it were to be victorious, would bring long-term stability within the country. This is unequivocally wrong. In order to demonstrate this point, I will read some excerpts from The Disintegration of the Syrian Regime is Worse Than You Think by Thomas Schneider. If our state-building adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan taught us anything, it was not to fall for the formal trappings of weak state institutions and to ignore colour-coded maps informed by faulty metrics. At its heart, A civil war is almost always a dispute over the basic premises of communal life and the institutions that structure it. The regime's force structure today is not entirely different from that of opposition militias. While much better supplied by the Syria Arab armies still stand in logistic skeleton, the government's fighting force today consists of a dizzying array of hyper-local militias aligned with various factions, domestic and foreign sponsors, and local warlords. Only a handful are still capable of anything close to offensive action, much more so than sectarian or demographic limitations. This fragmentation is a direct result of the interaction between national and local economics and government pressures. As the once totalitarian Syrian central state atrophies have gained a stunning degree of political and economic independence from Damascus. Today, where briefing maps now show solid red across Syria's western governance, they ought to distinguish dozens and perhaps even hundreds of small fiefdoms only nominally loyal to Assad. Indeed, in much of the country, loyalist security forces function like a grand racketing scheme, simultaneously a cause and consequence of state collapse at a local level. This next segment from the article I think demonstrates very well the level of instability inside regime-controlled areas. An incident occurred in February of this year that may serve as an example for what lies ahead. Engaged in heavy clashes with rebel forces near the town of Harabina Fasha, militia leader Ahmed Ismaili called on his fellow warlord in the neighbouring town of Barin for desperately needed reinforcements. Fadi Quaribish, I probably butchered that, head of Barin's armed men, rudely refused the request. The following day, feeling betrayed, and with a local ceasefire having taken effect, Ismaili turned his guns against Quaribish. Before long, he was joined by detachments from Hamas Air Force Intelligence, looking to support their preferred client and squash the insubordinate militia. But Quaribish successfully fought off the combined attack, and subsequently established his own checkpoints along the roads in the area, cutting into Ismaili's smuggling routes to the rebel pocket. The regime has not dared bother Barin since.
The power vacuum caused by the loss of the dictator causes a persistent civil war between the rebels. The chaos and Islamist links facilitate the Islamic State entering the country and gaining territory. This opens a new front on the global jihad currently being waged by these radical Islamists, and the West has to spend time and money in a futile attempt to contain the Islamic State in perpetuity, even though it was the West's own actions that help facilitate the spread of the Islamic State.
I hope that I've demonstrated that your idea of stability within regime-controlled areas is completely wrong. And secondly, I hope that I've demonstrated that even with these dictators here, these jihadists will come about. In fact, I would say they come about far more frequently than they would otherwise.
And make no mistake, Hillary wants to overthrow Assad. This is from the Hillary emails from WikiLeaks. The best way to help Israel deal with Iran's growing nuclear capability is to help the people of Syria overthrow the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Negotiations to limit Iran's nuclear program will not solve Israel's security dilemma, nor will they stop Iran from improving the crucial part of any nuclear weapons program, the capability to enrich uranium. At best, the talks between the world's major powers and Iran that began in Istanbul this April will continue in Baghdad in May, and will enable Israel to postpone by a few months the decision of whether to launch an attack on Iran that could provoke a major Middle East war. They go on to say that Iran's nuclear program and Syria's civil war may seem unconnected, but they are. For Israeli leaders, the threat isn't that they're worried about Iran having nukes, it's that they're worried about losing their nuclear monopoly. An Iranian nuclear weapons capability would not only end that nuclear monopoly, but also prompt other adversaries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt to go nuclear as well. The result would be a precarious nuclear balance in which Israel could not respond to the provocations with conventional military strikes on Syria and Lebanon as it can today. I just want to stress what a terrible thing this is. It's okay for the Islamic State to take over Syria as long as Iran and Egypt and Saudi Arabia do not challenge the nuclear hegemony that Israel has, in order that Israel can conduct conventional strikes with impunity and not worry about any kind of retaliation.
Well, there you have it. It is acceptable for the Islamic State to take over Syria, a apparently from the perspective of the United States. But while you're there, Sargon, talking about your defiance to jihadism at any cost, may I inquire as to why it is that you strongly oppose, very strongly oppose, one Islamic State taking over Syria, but do not oppose the other? In this case, I am talking, of course, about Iran. And to anyone who believes, genuinely, that Iran's ideology is vastly different from that of the Islamic State, you simply do not understand Iran and what it is trying to do. If you want to understand it, you have to understand one man, the Ayatollah Khamenei, the person who stole the Iranian Revolution from its people and instituted the Velayat al-Faqih. It was his dream to expand the borders of Iran throughout the Muslim world, to unite the Ummah under one banner, that of Iran, under the Velayat al-Faqih, and when he has hold of this caliphate, to use it to expand into the rest of the world, to conquer everyone. What does this remind you of? Can you think of one organization to which this sounds similar? I can. The Islamic State. Now, different jihadist forces go about this in different ways. Al-Qaeda, who want a caliphate as well, have declared that the first step in doing so is the removal of the United States from the Middle East. Iran tends to agree, but their method of removal differs. Al-Qaeda attempt to try and utilize terrorist attacks in the West to demotivate the Western population, to get them to attempt to lobby their government to pull out of the Middle East, and when that is done, the Sunni jihadists can take over, form their caliphate, and conquer. The Iranians have a different tactic. Their tactic is to get hold of a nuclear weapon of mass destruction, because what are you going to do then, once Iran is armed with a nuke? Are you going to intervene when they annex Bahrain, when they annex Iraq, or Syria, or Lebanon? What are you going to do? Nothing. You can't. And just as in the years before, when the Soviet Union would invade and annex with impunity, so too will Iran. Its imperial ambitions have been known about since the start, and there is one institution in Iran in charge of the expansion of its borders, in charge of the assurance that the Velayat al-Faqih shall endure. This is the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. And the most important aspect of that, the one which is most influential in terms of expansion, is the Quds Force, headed by Qassem Soleimani. To show you this man's nature, I'll describe the crime which he's most famous for. The flooding of Iraq with massive improvised explosive devices containing molten copper slugs that would go through titanium. It's estimated that his actions here led to the death of anywhere from 300 to 800 US service men and women within Iraq. But his primary function, what he's designed to do, is to go into countries and train militias, train Shia sectarian militias, which will then destabilize the country so that Iran in the future can move in and control the goings-on within that country. Some of the best known militias trained and armed by the Quds Force are the militias of Popular Mobilization, currently carrying out atrocities in Anbar province, and Liwa Fatamayun, a militia of 20,000 Afghani Shia migrants currently fighting on the side of, guess who? Bashir al-Assad. Throughout your video, Sargon, is talk of stability. Well, let me make for you a prediction. You think the Middle East is unstable now. Wait until Iran gets a nuclear weapon, and the slaughter to follow that will be beyond anything that we've seen before.
In service of the aim of overthrowing Bashar al-Assad, Hillary Clinton has said many times that she wishes to arm the Kurds.
I don't know where you get the idea that Hillary Clinton is somehow going to use the Syrian Democratic Forces to overthrow Assad, especially seeing as Assad still has a presence in their capital of Qamishli. But I suppose it's not really an important point, so I'll let it slide.
So, who are the Kurds? Well, the Kurds are a politically diverse ethnic group with about 30 million people spread across Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, with some in Armenia and Azerbaijan as well. Politically speaking, their major parties are either communists or nationalists, and these political parties are usually branded as terrorist groups in places like Turkey and Iran, where they have been fighting the government for decades. The United States has been funneling small arms to the Kurds for a long time, but that's not what they're asking for this time. This time they're asking for heavy arms, so they can destroy things like tanks and shoot down aircraft and whatnot. Now, I'm sure that anyone looking at this map can explain exactly why giving the Kurds heavy weapons is going to cause further destabilization of the Middle East. The Kurds have long wanted a homeland of their own, a sovereign Kurdistan, and one can hardly blame them for that, given the way that they've been treated by various Middle Eastern dictators. But arming them and allowing them to destabilize NATO members and Russian allies in pursuit of that homeland is probably not a wise move, which is why until now the US has not given them the heavy arms they've been asking for. This opinion seems to have changed though, as you can see from this email from John Podesta to Hillary Clinton. In it he says, in the past the US government, in an agreement with the Turkish General Staff, did not provide such heavy weapons to the Peshmerga, which are the Kurdish fighting forces, out of concern they would end up in the hands of Kurdish rebels inside of Turkey. The current situation in Iraq, not to mention the political environment in Turkey, makes this policy obsolete. Also, this equipment can now be airlifted directly into the Kurdish regional government's zone.
Now we're getting into the parts of the video that I don't just disagree with from an analysis perspective, but which are flat out wrong, not factual, and misleading. What you seem to be doing here, Sargon, is conflating two completely separate political entities. You are conflating Iraqi Kurdistan with Syrian Kurdistan. One, as you mentioned, is referred to as the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government. This is in Iraq, and its armed force is called the Peshmerga. The other is headed by the PYD. It calls itself Rojava, and its armed force is the Syrian Democratic Forces. These are not the same. You state that the United States has not, up until this point, given the Peshmerga heavy weapons. This is ludicrous. Of course we have. We have been giving these people heavy weapons for years. They fought alongside us when we were fighting the Sunni insurgency back in 2005. Sargon, I hate to say this, but there are parts in this video where you give the impression of a person who has opened his mouth to discuss a topic that he has no actual grasp of yet. You mention in your video as well the antagonism that exists between the Kurds and the Turks, and yet again you do not distinguish between Iraqi Kurdistan and Syrian Kurdistan. It is absolutely the case that the Turks hate the Kurds within Syria because the PYD is in effect the PKK in northern Syria, and the SDF, or the YPG if you will, is its armed wing. The PKK is the Kurdish Workers' Party, which has been fighting an insurgency against Turkey for 30 years now. Iraqi Kurdistan is not the same. It truly is not. It doesn't have the same political ideology. The only real similarity is the ethnicity of the people.
Hillary Clinton has been instrumental in the destabilization of North Africa. She seems to want the destabilization of the Middle East, and she seems to want it in order to fight Russia. In fact, she seems to want a hot war with Russia, instead of the proxy war that the US is currently fighting. And I say this because she has been repeatedly calling for a no-fly zone over Syria. So let's talk about Hillary Clinton's proposal for a no-fly zone over, and I'm sure she means, a no-fly zone over northern Syria. This is of course where Aleppo is, Gary Johnson, and it is the place where the Russians have been dropping their barrel bombs.
Sargon, do not say that. Do not take the piss out of Gary Johnson for not knowing where Aleppo is, and then state that the Russians are dropping barrel bombs. They're not. Why would they drop barrel bombs when they have a functioning air force using laser-guided weaponry? Why would they drop barrel bombs? They're not doing that, Sargon.
You may think that implementing a no-fly zone over Aleppo is the humanitarian thing to do, as it's going to save lives, isn't it? Well, maybe. But Hillary also knows it's going to cost lives to put in place. Again, thanks to WikiLeaks, we know that Hillary had a secret Goldman Sachs speech in which she said that no-fly zones would kill a lot of Syrians. In her remarks to Goldman Sachs, Clinton pointed to the Syrian government's air defense systems and noted that destroying them would take the lives of many Syrians. They're getting more sophisticated thanks to Russian imports. To have a no-fly zone, you have to take out all the air defense, many of which are located in populated areas. So our missiles, even if they are standoff missiles so we're not putting our pilots at risk, you're going to kill a lot of Syrians, she said. So all of a sudden, this intervention that people talk about so glibly becomes an American and NATO involvement where you take a lot of civilians. And she goes on to point out the differences between Syria and Libya and how in Libya it was possible to do this without mass civilian casualties. However, in Syria it's not going to be.
Sargon, do you really believe for 1 second that launching cruise missiles at air defense systems will in any way equate to the amount of death that is being caused every day in Aleppo by Assad's air force?
And I don't mean to sound callous when I say this, but implementing a no-fly zone over Aleppo means war with Russia.
What about the option of controlling the airspace so that barrel bombs cannot be dropped?
All the options.
What do you think of that option, sir?
Right now, Senator, for us to control all of the airspace in Syria would require us to go to war against Syria and Russia. That's a pretty fundamental decision that certainly I'm not going to make.
Preventing the Russians from supporting Assad by bombing Aleppo means destroying the anti-aircraft defenses they have in civilian areas. This means that the US will be free to shoot down any Russian craft that goes over the area. This will put the United States in a state of war with Russia. Now, this is not, as the general goes on to say that there cannot be a no-fly zone in Syria set up by the United States that doesn't cause a war with Russia. There potentially could be.
To impose a no-fly zone.
Chairman, could I for a second just answer?
No, Senator Gillibrand.
That's not what I said, Chairman.
Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I do think
What Senator asked me was to control all of the airspace.
No, what he asked was, should we have a no-fly zone so we can protect these people from being slaughtered? That's what he's talking about.
I answered that first.
That's what we're all talking about.
so. That would not require going to war, full scale, would it?
Not necessarily, Senator. I'm sorry, but I tried to answer the first question first, and then I was responding to the second part of your question. But I did not mean to say that imposing a no-fly zone would require us to go to war. That's not the question I was answering.
The question he was answering is, would being able to stop the Russians from barrel bombing Aleppo cause war? Which is why he said to control all of Syrian airspace would require war with Russia. The United States, of course, could set up no-fly zones over the United States and Allied control of Syria. They can't set up a no-fly zone over Aleppo, where they need it, without war with Russia.
No. Sargon, there is a reason why the Syrian regime is responsible for an estimated 90% of civilian casualties, and Russia only an estimated 5%, and that is because the Russians do not drop barrel bombs. Barrel bombs, by their name you might guess, are rather crude instruments. They're not guided weaponry. What you do is you go into a helicopter, fill a barrel with TNT, ignite it, push the barrel out the back of the helicopter and watch it land on densely populated civilian areas. The Russians don't do this. There is only one force that does this, the force of Assad. Now, what this means is that if you can bring down Assad's helicopters, if you can stop him from dropping these barrel bombs, then you can prevent 90% of civilian casualties within Aleppo without ever firing a shot at a single Russian craft. Now, returning to Libya, as I said that I would, Sargon doesn't even demonstrate the extent of the instability within the country. After the General National Congress believed that their democratic legitimacy would be rebuked, they seized power through the use of militias such as the Central Shield. The General National Assembly has been set up in the east, and the two have been fighting each other for some time. But not only this, but in the south, a war has erupted between tribes such as Tuareg and Tabu, fighting over control for this area of Libya. But a point of contention that I have with him is that he seems to be implying that ISIS is somehow flourishing in Libya when it's not. For a long time, they controlled about 100 kilometers of coastline. Now they've been pushed back to one neighborhood inside of the city of Sirte by a joint task force created by both the GNC and the GNA, which has completely pushed back the Islamic State. This task force is called the BAM forces. Nevertheless, it has to be said that Libya is a very unstable place, but however, I remind you that at the time of the NATO intervention, Libya was in a state of civil war. And as I've shown, in Syria, there is no stability whatsoever, and yet there was no intervention. The war carried on, and the disintegration of the country happened at a far more escalated rate than what occurred in Libya. Now, I'm not a mind reader. I don't know, perhaps Gaddafi would have brought stability to this country. However, I somewhat doubt it, especially when we're talking about a man who didn't even have his own army. He hired mercenaries to fight this war for him, and what would he do when they come to the conclusion that they can make more money robbing the local populace than by being paid by Gaddafi, as Assad's warlords have discovered themselves? What could he have done, perhaps, is the great question. Nothing. Nothing at all. One part of Sargon's commentary on Libya I will include here just because I think it's rather funny.
In February, before Allied bombing began, she noted that the political change in Egypt had proved tumultuous despite strong institutions. So imagine how difficult it will be in a country like Libya, she had said. Gaddafi ruled for 42 years by basically destroying all institutions and never even creating an army, so that it could not be used against him.
Forgive me if I'm wrong here, Sargon, but you seem to have an understanding of what the game of the dictator is. He keeps the country in a permanent state of crisis, guts the culture, destroys the institutions, keeps them right on the brink of oblivion constantly, so that he could never be removed, so that the times after he is gone will be extremely challenging. You think that we should keep someone in power who is slowly but surely disintegrating the internal makeup of that country. And for how long then, I wonder? How long would the people of Libya have had to have endured a man who has been known to inject political prisoners with AIDS? Forever, presumably. He's never going to improve the institutions. He has no reason to do so. He's constantly going to leave this country in a state of crisis, constantly leave it on the edge so that he can never be removed. So let's allow that to happen then. Because why risk anarchy? Why roll the dice? Allow this man to continue to enslave 7 million people because his institutions, they're just not that strong.
What we need right now is a clear message to the people of this country. This message must be read in every newspaper, heard on every radio, seen on every television. This message must resound throughout the entire interlink. I want this country to realize that we stand on the edge of oblivion. I want every man, woman, and child to understand how close we are to chaos. I want everyone to remember why they need us.
If there was some foreign policy experience or brilliance Hillary Clinton had ever shown, maybe we overlook the fact that she and her husband have never met a foreign political donor they don't like and haven't taken from the Riyadi family in Indonesia to numerous Chinese donors who left this country rather than show up for the hearings on it. But I don't know of any such expertise on her part, except her pretense to have been under fire in Bosnia when she had not. This woman doesn't really have any foreign policy experience worth mentioning. And what is memorable about it is pretty bad. We all remember, or we should, that when Les Aspin had then got the Clinton administration very nearly to do something about the horror in the Balkans that belatedly the Clinton administration did decide to stop, they delayed it because Hillary said, no, don't do it. It will take away attention from my brilliant, wonderful healthcare program that we all remember so well. At least on healthcare, she knows enough about the subject to have really changed American healthcare for the worse in her time. About foreign policy, she doesn't even know that much.
Well, this is fascism. And it's from the leader of the American anti-war movement. It's a disgrace and nobody says anything about it. It's I who am supposed to explain myself. People say to me, are you serious? You think Saddam Hussein should have been overthrown? Are you mad? Are you wicked? Are you evil? Are you drunk? Ah, but Ramsey Clark, good man. Get in there. Justify atrocity, torture, genocide, aggression, dictatorship. With a pure conscience. My other well-known opponent, probably better known perhaps in Europe, is George Galloway, member of the British House of Commons, member of the Ba'ath Party, certainly paid member of the Ba'athist elite, and member of the Oil for Food clientele that was organized by Mr. Tariq Aziz, friend of the Pope, last Pope. Well, Mr. Galloway was recently in Syria, where he described all the bombings, executions, decapitations, blowing up of mosques, of the offices of the Red Cross, of the United Nations, and all these in Baghdad, as martyrdom operations, praised them all, and did this specifically as the guest of and defender of the human toothbrush figure of Bashar al-Assad, the cretinous little dauphin of Syria, the last Syrian Ba'athist leader, as it will soon turn out. Well, what am I to say about this? This is anti-war? This is socialism? This is liberalism? No, it's fascism. It's power worship. Worship of the most unbridled kinds of power by the most unpleasant kinds of people.